Welcome to the new Hegelian Philosophy channel. I'd like to introduce a new series of videos on the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. In response to your patrons' request, we will be having a very intensive group reading of the Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas by John F. Whipple. In this first lecture, we will cover the introduction as well as the first two chapters. So as we get into the text itself, we notice, especially if we have access to a physical copy of this book, that this is a huge text on the metaphysical thought of Thomas Aquinas, which is strangely to be contrasted with the absence of any such work by Thomas Aquinas himself. In other words, you may be surprised to learn as a modern reader that Aquinas himself never wrote such a book. He never wrote the Summa Metaphysica, although he did write a volumes-long work, the Summa Theologica, which answered basically every question you could think of about theology or religion. And some Aquinas scholars have argued, well, that's the whole point, insofar as Aquinas seemed to reach metaphysical conclusions, which you might be tempted to try to group together into his metaphysics as such. These were always, according to these scholars, just a byproduct of him doing what he was really interested in, which was theology. Insofar as Aquinas seemed to reach metaphysical conclusions, it was always just a side effect of him really focusing on religion. According to these scholars, even the works by Aquinas, which seem to be explicitly philosophical in nature, are really just his attempt to do the history of philosophy, basically. He's giving commentaries on the works of Aristotle and other such thinkers, and therefore you'd be misled to even try to put together the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas as such. Well, this is exactly what John F. Whipple does not believe about Thomas Aquinas, for he argues that this gets the priority exactly backwards. He argues that Aquinas was only able to write such systematic and consistent works on theology and other religious concerns because he already had a well-worked-out metaphysics in the background, providing the foundation for that work. Despite the fact that he didn't present that whole metaphysical system in a single coherent text dedicated to the topic, it still was there in the background of all of his other work. Well, that missing treatise on Aquinas' metaphysics is exactly what Whipple seeks to restore in this book. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the structure of this text is a little unusual in that part 1 begins with the third chapter. The first 3 sections of the text are largely dedicated to examining how Aquinas accounted for our ability to understand what being is in a pre-metaphysical manner. So very few people in the history of the world have ever actually done metaphysics, which is the theoretical science by which you put together an explicit understanding of what being qua being means. Very, very few people have ever done that, and yet we all know what being is because we're able to intuitively recognize being in those things which really exist. And this sort of intuitive discovery of being is going to be the concern of this first video. Now, as we get into the first chapter of the text titled Aquinas on the Nature of Metaphysics, we have to start by situating metaphysics relative to the other sciences as they were understood in the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages largely accepted Aristotle's division of the sciences into theoretical, practical, and productive. To put it very briefly, a theoretical science seeks, timeless truths, like, say, in mathematics, whereas a practical science, like ethics or politics, is oriented towards having one's action achieve a goal in pursuit of the good, as productive sciences concern humans' ability to actually make things. So the best example of that is, of course, poetry in the sense of, like, the works of Homer. But when we talk about poetry in modern English, we maybe don't realize that we're just using a transliteration of the ancient Greek word for making things in general. It's true that the best example of that is the poetry of Homer, which is a pretty thing made of words, but poiesis extended to many other types of making, like, say, pottery or carpentry. So it's quite clear, I think, from this that metaphysics would be a theoretical science because the goal is to understand not just any sort of timeless truth, but really the highest of all of these. And we'll only really understand this, though, if we contrast it with the other theoretical sciences, not arbitrarily, but in the terms that Aquinas understood them to be different from one another, which was basically how free they are from matter and motion. For matter and motion are kind of the antithesis of the sort of necessity that you would have in a theoretical understanding of something, because matter and motion are the kind of contingency and change which is the opposite of the sort of truth you are pursuing. Another reason why the theoretical sciences were largely defined by their opposition to matter and motion followed from the medieval understanding of how the intellect works. It was understood in the Middle Ages that the intellect is an inherently immaterial thing, so it understands things better insofar as they are immaterial. Things need not be inherently or originally immaterial, like physical objects, for the intellect can understand them, but largely through abstracting their form from their matter in a way that Aristotle compared to the way that you can put a gold ring in a piece of wax, and then even after you remove the gold, the material cause, the form of the ring, the circle, will still remain in the wax. And that's kind of like the way that the intellect understands things, by taking an immaterial form from the material that it was originally instantiated in. So if we consider the three main theoretical sciences of the Middle Ages, physics, mathematics, and metaphysics, we'll see that they are ordered relative to one another in terms of how pure they are with regard to this freedom from matter and motion. So physics is a theoretical science of nature, but its subject matter inherently makes it the least pure of these theoretical sciences, because it studies the kinds of things which require matter not only in their actual existence, for after all they are physical things, but also require matter in order to be properly understood by the intellect. If you try to have an understanding of the natural entity called man, for example, you won't really understand him if you don't include the physical body in that understanding. So another way to phrase this is to say that the truths of physics are kind of less pure than the truths of mathematics and metaphysics, because their dependence on matter and motion makes them the least necessary of them. Next, of course, you have mathematics, in which you study objects which, at least as far as Aquinas understood in the Middle Ages, do require matter for their existence, but don't require matter for their understanding by the intellect. So the medieval idea of mathematics is that in mathematics you consider quantities in abstraction from the matter of which they were quantities, to put it very bluntly. So you could study something like a point or a line, which are abstracted from material things, but when you understand them, you view them totally ideally. This is kind of like the Platonic idea that you only really understand what a circle is if you make it a purely abstract construct of your thinking. That's how you apply the formulae to it. You'll understand a circle much more poorly if you merely consider a circular object which is instantiated in matter, even if, according to Aquinas, you only got the ideal circle by abstracting it from the material circular object. Now, finally, there are those things which are totally independent of matter, not only for their existence, but also for their intellectual understanding. And this is roughly what had traditionally been called metaphysics, but for Thomas Aquinas, there are basically two different kinds of sciences which you have to split that up into. On the one hand, you have the study of particular kinds of things, which not only incidentally can be thought of outside matter, but which always exist outside matter because they're positively immaterial, to use the wording of John F. Whipple. They can't exist in matter because they're things like God and the angels, etc. And that's the concern of what Thomas Aquinas would call the divine science. There is a science dedicated to study those spiritual beings, but that's not to be equated or confounded with metaphysics as such. For metaphysics studies immaterial things which are not positively immaterial in the way that God or the angels exclude matter by their very definition, but rather things which can occur within material things but need not do so. For example, every materially instantiated animal is a substance with potentiality and actuality. But then again, every immaterial angel also has those features as well. Every immaterial angel is also a substance with potentiality and actuality. So a substance, potency, act, these are the sort of terms which are actually studied in metaphysics not only because they apply to every being whatsoever, rather than to just a small class of beings like the spiritual beings, God, the angels, etc., but also because these can be understood on rational grounds alone. Aquinas conceded that most of what was known about God and the angels was not derived through reason, but rather through divine revelation. In the Middle Ages, he conceded that most of what was known about God had to be divinely revealed in a holy scripture like the Bible, because it was the sort of mysteries which, no matter how long you think in dialogue with the mind with itself, you won't be able to arrive at them. But that's okay. That can be handled by divine science. Metaphysics is largely going to focus on those universal abstract features of any being whatsoever, like, once again, substance, potency, act, etc. But in addition to those, it'll also try to arrive at an ultimate definition of what being qua being might be. But before we get to that, we consider in the second chapter the way that even though extremely few people will ever do metaphysics in that sense, arriving at an explicit definition of being, everybody still knows what being means because they can intuitively recognize or discover it in existing things. This, however, is a very complicated sort of operation which can only really be explained for Thomas Aquinas through contrasting two different kinds of operations of the intellect called the first and the second. Now, these will sound like very unusual terms to modern readers, but they actually are better known in traditional logic as the difference between apprehension and comprehension. So in traditional logic, you can apprehend, say, the dictionary level meaning of a single term without, however, putting it into the sort of judgment which could either be true or false. For example, if I just consider the term dog, well, dog in and of itself is neither true nor false, because at that level I'm just apprehending it as another word in a dictionary or a lexicon of other meanings. I can only have a truth value if certain truth conditions are specified through combining that one term, or indivisible, as Thomas Aquinas would have called it, with another term in a broader judgment. If I say, for example, this dog is a beagle, or this dog is white and brown in color, then okay, that can be true or false, because now we got truth conditions. We have a quality, a quantity relation, etc., to use the Kantian terms. So Aquinas argued that this distinction between first and second operation of the intellect is necessary to understand how we recognize or discover being in things which really exist, for the following reason. Now, Aquinas argued that the logical operation whereby we recognize that something exists is to be contrasted with the operation whereby we merely apprehend it, because for him, the first operation, as it is called, simply abstracts the quiddity, which is the Latin word for the whatness after all. In Latin, quid is what, the whatness or the nature, basically the definition of something, which is not enough on its own to determine whether that thing actually exists. In order to establish that something of that type exists, we actually have to place being into the predicate position. So I can apprehend, for example, what that something is a dog, but I can only comprehend that that dog is if I make the ising, or the being, the predicate as a second term. Now, Aquinas used the following three Latin terms, which we'll have to use over the rest of this book to avoid the confusion of translation, of unsatisfactory translations, to explain how this worked. So in the mere apprehension of a term, you establish its quiddity or whatness or definition or nature. In addition to that, you could have a broader judgment which also attributes being to it, with the word being esse in Latin for Aquinas, and the composite of both of those, a complete being which has both a nature and being or existence, is called an ens, from which we get the modern English term an entity. Now, we might think of how this works by considering the example of our different understanding of an elephant bird and an ostrich. Now, they're both really big birds from Africa, but the difference is that I can understand the quiddity, the nature, the definition of an elephant bird, without, however, being able to actually comprehend truthfully that any such entity today exists. In contrast, I can both understand the quiddity or the definition of an ostrich, while also, if I see one, recognizing that it still has being. So the composite of both a quiddity and an act of being, or esse, is an ens, which I can apply to an ostrich, whereas for an elephant bird, because it no longer exists as an extant animal, I cannot. Now, it must be mentioned that Whipple's own interpretation of how this works is not going to find universal agreement among other Thomas Aquinas scholars. For some Aquinas scholars argue that the thing's existence is already captured by the intellect in the first operation, or the apprehension of what it is, because insofar as you have a second operation compose terms together, this always just produces a synthesis of universal concepts. So because you're just combining abstract concepts, that doesn't intrinsically have anything to do with the kind of real being which Whipple would argue can be discovered in that second operation. Well, Whipple disagrees with this reading, as convincing as it might sound, for the following reasons. We recall that for lower beings, their quiddity or definition can be directly apprehended, but their being must be comprehended in a broader act of judgment, because these two are not the same thing. As created beings, their essence, however, is also composite. It is composed of both form and matter. Their essence, therefore, can only transition from a state of potentiality to a state of actuality if it is actualized in a given real entity through an act of being within that entity. This is basically how Whipple prefers to translate the Latin term esse, is as an act of being. But how on earth can that actually take place? Well, within medieval metaphysics, a given being can make that transition from potential to actual only if some extrinsic agent acts as the efficient cause, which actualizes the act of being within that thing. This ultimately, of course, takes us back to God as the creator of everything, the unique, uncaused, efficient cause of the whole chain of effects. But whereas the cartoon caricature of creation would lead us to think that God composes or puts things together by literally taking various physical pieces of a puzzle and then putting them into the right positions with regard to one another, like the building blocks of a child, Aquinas viewed creation much more abstractly than that. For Aquinas, you have to have a composition even of terms as abstract as quiddity and esse themselves. You have to compose the nature or definition of a thing with its act of being, which God does through actualizing the act of being within these things. The catch is that that act of being is in turn limited by the essence of the finite thing which receives the act from the creator. Only this limitation by the thing's essence can explain why all of these created beings are different from one another, despite receiving an act of being from the same God. It's this interplay between quiddity and esse which accounts not only for the fact that all of these things exist, but the fact that they are also unique or different from one another. Likewise, because essence and the act of being are not the same thing, the apprehension of an indivisible term is not the same as the judgment which recognizes that it has being, or to put it more bluntly, that it is. What such a judgment recognizes is not the mere existence of a thing, but instead the much stronger act of being within it, which has a dynamic character which cannot be reduced to its abstract essence. To understand this, we must recall how Aquinas understood the architecture of human subjectivity to work, as most people don't know that he actually did put together a blueprint of subjective experience, kind of like the one which Kant proposed in the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, like Kant, Aquinas argued that experience begins with the sensations which are received through the five senses. However, he contrasted mere sensation with perception in the proper sense of the term, for he argues that perception only occurs when one of the subject's sense powers is passively acted upon by the perceived object, which causes the object to fall under that particular sense power in contrast with the others. For example, if the sense power of sight is activated by some object, then that object is going to appear to me as something with a color. In contrast, if the sense power of smell is activated, then it's going to appear to me as something with a particular odor. So we realize that our perception doesn't always just consist of sight. It also consists of these other sensations because particular objects are going to activate different sense powers. Well, how on earth then do we account for our discovery on a purely intuitive level that something exists? Well, Whipple argues that there is actually a sixth sense. There is also a sense power which causes something to appear as a thing with actuality. Whipple dared to argue that in addition to the usual list of 5 senses, sight, smell, sound, etc., there's also a sixth sense, which is literally our sense of being. This is the sense which registers that some perceived object exists and therefore is not a mirage or a hallucination, without having to logically deduce that from the inputs of the other 5 senses. In other words, we might intuitively think that we first build a composite image of the various sights, smells, sounds, etc. that we got from a thing, and then deduce from that sum total that in addition to having sight, smell, sound, etc., it also exists. But that's not how Whipple understood this to work. Instead, he argued that there's literally a sense of being which intuitively registered that something exists because it happened to activate that sense power within the subject in much the same way that a strong smelling object would activate the sense of smell. Now, as complicated as this may seem, this is still just a smaller part of a much bigger picture, for according to Aquinas, in addition to these outer sense powers, there's also an inner sense power within the subject called common sense. This is not the common sense of modernity, which is your ability to judge what the right thing is to do without explicitly learning. Rather, this is the sort of common sense which is responsible for cleanly sorting the inputs of the 5 senses relative to one another. It's common sense, for example, which cleanly distinguishes a smell from a taste or a color. Now, Whipple argues that common sense also sorts out our awareness of the act of being as present within something from the other types of sense data inputs received from that subject. Now, once again, this does not mean that you have a full-blown metaphysical definition or understanding of being qua being. Rather, it means that you are able to intuitively register the real existence of a thing through sorting out the sixth sense from the other 5. Now, the full account, though, is a little more complicated even than that, for according to Aquinas, what actually happens in perception is that the various sense data are synthesized by common sense into a coherent, singular image of the thing, and it's that image which is then preserved by the imagination as a likeness of the original object, which is called a phantasm. The phantasm is then what is understood in the proper sense of the term through having its nature or quiddity be recognized by the intellect in the first operation through abstracting its essence from what was originally just a bundle of various different sense contents. And the way this is done is through submitting what is intelligible to the immaterial intellect, through having the universal be sifted out from all of the individuating factors which were present in the original object. Now, this phase should, of course, ring a bell, for this is just what modern logicians call apprehension. This is something which does not yet have a truth value because it is not a judgment composed of 2 terms. That, of course, will only occur in the second operation, and this is exactly where Whipple and Aquinas understood the existence of the thing to be posited as a second term in addition to its mere quiddity. The reason for this division is not only that the quiddity or nature is abstract because it is universal, whereas the act of being is individualized to a particular object we recognize as being real. It's also something which occurs in the second rather than first operation because it requires the intellect to perform an act of reflection. The intellect has to reflect back upon the phantasm to form the judgment, even one as simple as this X is. Now, the really technical reason why you have to establish the existence or being of a thing in the second operation rather than get it for free and merely apprehending it as an individual in the first operation is as follows. It really has to do with the difference between abstraction and separation, which might intuitively seem like the same thing. They're like two different interchangeable terms for the same idea, but for Aquinas, there's actually a really big difference between abstraction and separation, which he used to sort the theoretical sciences from one another. The difference really for Aquinas between physics, mathematics, and metaphysics has to do with whether you're abstracting or separating. In physics, for example, abstraction is enough because in observing various entities within nature, the whole point is to abstract a universal law of nature from the various particular entities which you observe, in which the whole point is to negate their individuality to derive some law which applies to all of them. Similarly, in mathematics, abstraction is enough because you understand quantities only through abstracting them from the real material things in which they're instantiated, for the same reason that for Plato, you understand the idea of a circle much better than a merely circular object. However, in metaphysics, you don't actually use abstraction, but rather separation, because in establishing that something is, for example, you don't abstract its being away from the individual in which it is found. Instead, you basically join them together. That's the point of the judgment, which, although they're kind of separated as terms within the logical statement, they actually are combined or composed in reality in the existent thing, which both has a nature quiddity and an active being or esse in order to form the composite, the whole of an ens or entity. So separation as a logical procedure allows me to put the subject and predicate into different positions within a judgment without abstracting the predicate away from it, for the whole point is to recognize that being as concretely, or to use the better medieval philosophy term, actually there. Now, another fine detail which scholars continue to disagree on is whether we are able to establish our understanding of immaterial factors of metaphysics before or after recognizing them in positively immaterial things like God and the angels. Some Aquinas scholars argue that, well, yes, you are able to understand substance, potency, actuality as such as immaterial factors applicable to any being whatsoever, only because you first observe them in the positively immaterial things like God and the angels. Well, Whipple disagrees with this because it gets the order of priorities exactly backwards. The goal of doing metaphysics in general is to be able to understand God as the ultimate being. But this treats that knowledge of God as a presupposition which you had to have before you began the thing that was oriented towards accomplishing that. For this reason, Whipple argues that no, you start with studying metaphysics in general applicable to any kind of being, and then use that to understand God in a rational manner. So this will conclude our first video. I look forward to more on this fascinating text, and I thank the patron for this request.